Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Foley. So John, I'll have you come on camera when you're ready. Here he is. John, hi, great to see you. John is a world-renowned climate scientist and our executive director at Project Drawdown. During today's webinar, John will reflect on climate action over the past year and share some exciting plans for advancing climate action in 2024. Great to see you, John. Take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Todd, for all the help for the seminar today. And thanks to all of you. God, we're about 600 people all around the world and climbing joining us today. This is the wonders of telepresence, which is fantastic. And no jet fuel was burned in the making of this video, so this is fantastic. Let me go ahead and start sharing some slides and give an overview of kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And let's get this up and running here. Okay, here we are. So this is part of an ongoing seminar series we've had at Project Drawdown called Drawdown Ignite, where we've been kind of diving deep into particular topics throughout the year. But this time of year, at the kind of end of the calendar year, we thought it'd be good to kind of reflect back a little bit on 2023 and the state of climate solutions, and also highlighting the work of Project Drawdown, which is focused exclusively on climate solutions, kind of telling you a little bit about our work and the past, what we've done this year, but also moving into the future. But as we reflect on this day, looking at the end of the COP28 meetings, all the incredible things that have happened this year, good and bad, with respect to climate change, taking stock of what is going on today is really kind of a tug of war. Because I feel, and probably like a lot of you, that we're still in a race now between two really different futures, two different visions of what the world could look like. One of those we got an even worse glimpse of this year, a world where we don't get it right, where climate change continues to get worse and worse and worse. We're already seeing the impacts of a warming atmosphere on our planet, on our weather patterns, our ecosystems, our natural resources, and the most vulnerable people in the world. We don't want that to get worse. Already, though, it is here, it is present, it's causing harm, but it could get so much worse than this if we don't take enough action, if we don't make enough of a difference. And that's a future we don't want. But another future is also being glimpsed this year and in the future is a world where we start to get it right. No, we're not going to avoid all of climate change. Some of it's on our doorstep already here today, but maybe we can avoid the worst of it. And when we do that, the good news about climate action is not only do we avoid a disaster of the worst outcomes of possible climate change, we end up not just avoiding the problem, we end up building a better world as a result. A world that's not only more sustainable, it could also be more prosperous, more equitable, and more secure. So this is a good world and something we should be working toward. And I believe, and I think all of you do too, we can still win this race. It's tight, it's neck and neck. We don't know what the outcome's going to be, but we still have a little bit of a shot at this. And if we work hard and we really redouble our efforts, we can make this happen. But I think it's fair to say right now, we're not making the progress we need, not fast enough, not big enough, and we're feeling a little stuck, I think, sometimes by things that are just not happening the way we need them to. One of the ways we've been stuck, I think, is by all the noise and confusion out there about what should we do? What's the most effective set of climate solutions? What is the best strategy for implementing them? And what are the best levers we need to pull to make them a reality in the world? We're still a bit confused. There's a lot of disagreement, a lot of noise, and we need to cut through that. We also have to move beyond just the confusion and recognize there are still bad actors in the system. People who are trying very hard, and we saw this on full display at COP28, to delay action on climate change because it interferes with their profits. So they're going to try the tricks of delay and distraction, and we can't allow that anymore. We have to move beyond that and cut through that as quickly as possible. And I think it's fair to say during all of this work, we're all gripped at times, at least, by moments of doubt and despair about, like, why aren't we doing better? How is this happening? Why are all these terrible things happening in the world? That's a very natural human reaction, of course, to a world that seems to be getting out of control sometimes. But I hope we can also move through that natural reaction to the other side, where we redouble our commitment and realize, yes, there are moments of doubt and despair, but there are also moments of celebration and joy and opportunity we can move forward and change the world with. This is where Drawdown comes in. This is what we do, is to cut through those three limits. Our work is built on three key pillars that we want to help stop climate change by doing three important things. First and foremost, to advance science-based solutions, but also science-based strategies. It isn't enough to know what to do. We also need to know how to do it. And using evidence, using science to guide us along that journey is critical. So let's make sure we do that. We also have to make sure that we foster bold leadership that cuts through the greenwashing and the hype and the deliberate delays and distractions and shows what's possible to inform and inspire and empower leaders around the world to change the way the things work today. And also, I think it's important that we promote new narratives and new voices to have a more inclusive conversation about climate change that brings unrepresented voices to the table for the first time, really, but also to focus on the opportunities and possibilities and, dare I say, maybe even hope of building a better world. So I want to walk through each of these with you today and show you what's going on, not only in the broader world, but also here at Project Drawdown. So first, focusing on how science can help guide us, because science can help cut through all that noise and confusion and help us figure out what the best thing is to do. So here we are. We have to figure out what we have to do. When I think about climate action and what's necessary, I often think about chess, because in chess, we have to consider many different moves and many different pieces from the opening gambit all the way to checkmate. It's a complex game of strategy. We need to think like this too when it comes to climate change. We have the pieces, all of the solutions out there that cut emissions, that maybe remove some carbon and even other indirect ways that help address climate change. These physical things we call solutions that lower the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Yep, and Project Drawdown knows these better than anybody. But we also have the tactics, or what we call accelerators, that move the solutions out into the world. Things like policy, moving money, moving people and their human capital, changing the way businesses work, changing behavior, technology, and so on. And together, these solutions and these accelerators together form the board in which we're going to play this game. This is the chessboard, the operating space for climate action. Now today, this morning, we all probably woke up to hear that COP28, the big UN conference on climate change action, was a mixed bag. There were some good things that happened, in particular, a focus on methane, on creating new funds for loss and damage. Some other major breakthroughs did happen, but the final language is probably less than a lot of us wanted. It didn't go far enough in calling for the absolute phase out of fossil fuels. It had a lot of weasel words and diplomatic kind of outs for things along the way, of course. What would we expect? But also, it wasn't really legally enforceable. It's kind of suggested. It's a guiding document. It's not legally binding. Most COPs aren't. But that's not the whole board, remember? COP28 only lives here in this part of the board. It's the international goals and policies kind of conversation. But there's so many other ways, and I want to remind us all of this. There are many ways to implement climate solutions in the world. We can think about how we deploy money, how we deploy human capital and ourselves, how we change the roles of business, our own behaviors, the roles of technology, and so on, and so on, and so on. So just like in chess, to win the climate game, we have to see the whole board. If we only focus on one corner of the board with only one piece, we can't win. We have to think about the larger strategy and see all of the opportunities this affords us, not just one. So just remember that, see the whole board. Even one part, maybe it doesn't look so great some days. There are plenty of other places we can make moves too. And along the way, we got to make sure that these solutions, the pieces on the board, really are effective and they're good at what they do. And this is what Drawdown's historically been known for, of course, is our work to kind of gauge the effectiveness of different climate solutions. Here's our latest assessment of solutions in electricity, for example, like, which solutions are here and effective today. You see solar, you see wind, you see geothermal, you'll see nuclear, hydro, but also energy efficiency, which we don't talk nearly enough about. We see solutions in food, like curbing food waste, shifting diets, regrowing, protecting rainforest and growing food regeneratively are all kind of part of the food solutions mix here, of course, and the whole universe of solutions. This is all a critical part of what we continue to do, is make sure we're using the most effective solutions. What's also important is to recognize what's not on this list. What's not on our list of climate solutions would include things like fusion. Nope, it's not here yet. Or advanced nuclear reactors. Nope, they're not really in the real world yet. Or carbon capture or direct air capture. Nope, they're not a real viable climate solution yet. So we can look at the effectiveness of solutions, but also their economic performance. For example, we can also see the cost of climate solutions, here showing what's called a cost curve, where we look at climate solutions from the cheapest ones on the left all the way to the most expensive on the right. The really good news of all this analysis shows that climate solutions are actually pretty cheap. About 80% of climate solutions already today are cheaper in the long run compared to fossil fuels or bad agriculture or polluting industries. 80% of the solutions, all those below the line, are cheaper than the world we have right now. So we don't have to argue so much about the economic trade-offs of climate solutions. It's a win-win. It's good for the environment and for the economy. Yes, maybe 20% of the solutions aren't quite there yet, and that's where we need to focus our continued R&D work, maybe a little bit of subsidies, and find ways to drive down these costs to make those affordable. But 80% of the job is already there, and in the marketplace, climate solutions can definitely compete and win on a fair playing field where fossil fuels aren't being subsidized so much. So that's kind of the what of climate action. And we've focused a lot of that at Project Drawdown in the past, giving people the best possible tools to address climate change. But it's not enough to have a good toolbox. We also need to know how to build things with the tools. And that's moving from the what to the how. A lot of the work we've done in the last year has focused on this how of climate action. And it often boils down to this big curve. This curve shows in red the emissions of greenhouse gases that are causing the problem in the atmosphere. This is a big number, folks. It's almost 60 billion tons of greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, N2O, and beyond. That number is big, and it's been going up historically. If we kept doing that and got into the dotted line extrapolating to the future, it takes a big thing, a bad problem, and makes it worse. But we want to do the opposite, of course. We need to cut emissions drastically and quickly and cut them as much as we can through the middle of the century. That's what's required to really take bold climate action. Now, of course, we may not get all of the emissions. There are going to be some so-called hard-to-abate emissions, like cement, steel, jet fuel, fertilizers, things like this, that we may not be able to eliminate completely with renewables and other alternatives. So that's where the idea of carbon removal, the green curve, comes in. If we can increase carbon removal to some meaningful scale in the billions of tons range, we can use that to kind of remove that last little bit of pollution and hit so-called net zero. The problem with carbon removal, though, is right now it's basically zero. There isn't any as far as the atmosphere is concerned. Even if we had 1 million times more carbon removal projects on Earth today than we presently do, it would still be invisible on this graph. It's too small, and it's too expensive for the most part. So we're going to have to do a lot of work to scale up carbon removal, and that means most of the job is going to be cutting emissions and cutting them deep, cutting them fast. There's no mathematical way around that. But the other thing we have to remember is that climate action is cumulative over time. It doesn't happen in 1 year. It's the work of many years added together. Just like climate change, the problem is cumulative. The temperatures we see on Earth this year aren't because of this year's emissions. They're because of the last 100 and 200 years of emissions building up in the atmosphere, thickening the blanket of greenhouse gases, warming the planet. So in the future, climate change also needs to experience cumulative solutions. If we cut emissions deeply in this first decade like this, it prevents that much carbon from going in the atmosphere, of course. But if those emissions cuts are permanent, the impact keeps building decade after decade accumulating into a very large total impact on the atmosphere. That whole blue area of carbon was avoided going into the atmosphere. We can cut emissions in the future again and again, but the longer we wait to cut emissions, the less impact it has on the atmosphere. Waiting doesn't help. It's too late to wait, as the saying goes. We need to take deep cuts now and let those have a cumulative impact on the atmosphere to make a difference in climate change. Carbon removal, while still being very important, faces a real uphill battle in this respect. That right now it's close to zero. It'll take a long time to scale. And by the time it does, it only has a limited amount of time to have a big impact. So most of the work of addressing climate change still needs to be cutting emissions and cutting them very quickly. And this tells us something we helped introduce to the world this year is a concept called the time value of carbon. Just like the time value of money, it means early investments pay off handsomely in the future. That's why we've also introduced a concept we call the emergency brakes for climate change. Emergency brakes are climate solutions that can be implemented quickly, and when they're implemented, they act on the atmosphere very, very fast. Things like stopping deforestation, which has an immediate impact on the atmosphere, or stopping methane leaks from oil and gas or methane emissions from agriculture, because methane has a huge impact on climate change, especially in the first decade or two after it's emitted. It's a fast-acting part of the climate system. So cutting methane emissions means it has a disproportionately fast emergency brake kind of impact on addressing climate change. Other things in this emergency brake space would include black carbon. It would include energy efficiency, cutting food waste, things that we could do very fast with a lot of impact. And that buys us time to allow other solutions to start to kick in, like building out new infrastructure, which takes time and money to unfold new transportation, energy, buildings, and infrastructure systems. It allows time for nature-based solutions like planting new trees, regenerative agriculture, restoring wetlands, to build up carbon in trees and soils and wetlands and so on. And it allows for new technologies to mature and to shake out so we figure out which ones really will work and how to grow them to scale. So time is a really important dimension of climate action, and one that this year at Project Drawdown, we've been hitting very, very hard trying to get that concept out into the world. Another critical concept we really need to hone in on as we address climate change, and Drawdown has focused a lot on this, is that we're not just trying to solve climate change all by itself. We should be addressing climate change also with an eye towards improving the human condition, human well-being, health, security, the economy, but also equity and justice, helping the most vulnerable among us first and most. And wow, we have enormous opportunities to do this and do this better. For example, we can see here how greenhouse gas emissions that warm the atmosphere are accompanied by air pollution that affects human health in significant ways. It's been estimated that the soot and particulate matter and ozone and smog caused by burning fossil fuels is causing the premature deaths of up to 9 million people a year. That's right, about 9 million people a year on this planet today are dying prematurely because of the air pollution caused by fossil fuels. So phasing out fossil fuels and dirty fuels in general can help not only address climate change, it improves the lives and health of millions of people around the world, especially the poorest and most vulnerable among us. So this is a huge opportunity to clean up the atmosphere and improve human lives. In the last couple of weeks, we've been hitting this especially hard at Project Drawdown. We released a report very recently showing, for example, that black carbon or soot that's produced from dirty diesel engines and burning biofuels and dung and other things that are released to the atmosphere are a major problem with climate change, but also a huge human health problem. So addressing black carbon, the soot of burning dirty fuels, not only can address climate change, it's also one of the biggest things we can do to improve human health, especially amongst the poorest and most vulnerable. A big part of this is also in the area of clean cooking, helping people cook using cleaner fuels, ultimately with renewable energy sources, is not only a good emergency brake climate solution, it has huge co-benefits for equity, justice, and health in much of the world. So we at Project Drawdown have been focusing a lot in the last year, not only advancing on the solutions of climate change, but also on the right strategies to develop them. And earlier this year, we were really proud to launch what we call the Drawdown Roadmap, which is using science to develop those strategies and guide the most effective climate action. If you haven't seen it yet, please check it out. It's at drawdown.org/roadmap. Very easy to find on our website. It includes 5 great short videos that describe this kind of roadmap in action and how it's being used around the world. It also has been featured at TED conference this summer, and the full TED video, this will be launched hopefully in February after the new year. So it'll help get some more traction at this point. So we've been talking about solutions, the whole chessboard, the roadmaps, and so on. But another thing I think it's really important to do, especially after this pretty disappointing COP meeting, is to remind ourselves that, hey, maybe some things are working, and we should take a look at those and figure out what it is. So the big question, is anybody making progress on climate change? Well, my good colleague, James Gerber at Project Drawdown, our lead kind of data scientist, he actually just did this analysis for me the other day where I asked him, hey, can we look at all of the emissions data for every year and every sector in every country and figure out where we're making any progress? Well, here's what you can find right away. It turns out that all of the green countries in the world are actually cutting their emissions over the last 20 years quite significantly. A lot of people are surprised to find that and find that includes like the United States. But yeah, it turns out that the United States emissions of greenhouse gases peaked in 2007, and they're now about 21% below that. And yes, that does include trade with China and the rest of the world back and forth. Even accounting for that, we have about a 20% cut in the overall emissions of the US economy. That's incredible. The UK's cut its emissions by 40%. Most of Europe's included in this. Also, other countries around the world are making great progress on cutting emissions. Not enough, but starting with this, that dozens of countries are lowering their emissions, we can start to look at what's working. What is causing some countries to lower their emissions, and then figure out what that is and accelerate it and spread it to the rest of the world. But also to figure out, well, what's not working, and make sure we focus that on those solutions and unlock solutions in areas that maybe aren't working so well. So let's look at the United States as an example. Here's a little breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions over the last 2 decades or so in the United States and what the trend lines are. So here we show all the different sectors, and I'll just walk you through them very briefly. It turns out what's leading the way on cutting emissions in the United States, first and foremost, is reducing the amount of emissions from electricity. We're getting cleaner electricity. We're getting rid of coal. Coal's dead in the United States for the most part, vanishing before our very eyes faster than a lot of us ever thought possible. Natural gas is still there, but beginning to also phase out. And renewables are just exploding, growing faster and getting cheaper than anybody ever thought possible. And this is great. So electricity is leading the way. But we're also seeing emissions cuts in buildings, in industry, and other energy processing sources. Where we're not seeing very much so far is in transportation. It was going down, then it kind of went up again, and it's kind of going back and forth. So transportation is an area that's kind of soft right now in the United States. We need to do better on transportation for sure. But the one that's kind of depressing is at the top. It turns out the only area where emissions in the US are rising still quite a lot is in food, agriculture, and land use. That's about 10% of the US emissions right now, but it's growing and the others are falling. We could imagine a future where we address a lot of climate change, but we're left with agriculture being the biggest emission in the United States, maybe by the end of the 2030s. And we're not alone. It turns out this is a map showing around the world which countries where agriculture emissions in food, agriculture, and land use, which globally are 25% of all the emissions of greenhouse gases come from food and agriculture and land use. Almost 30% to 35% of all emissions are in the larger food system. If we include food transit, processing, refrigeration, and landfills where food waste ends up, those are usually accounted for in other sectors. But when we look at the larger food system, it's mainly going up around the world. So I think what this teaches us is that when we're seeing early progress in climate change, it's mainly in electricity first, kind of decarbonizing electricity. We've got solar, we've got wind, and we've got batteries, and they're getting faster, cheaper, and scaling like crazy, faster than anybody thought possible. That's the good news. We're also getting rid of coal in the electricity sector. That's good news. Other sectors will follow. Buildings and transportation can use electricity to make greener cars, greener homes, greener buildings that emit less. That's all good. But in agriculture, we're not doing nearly enough, and those solutions are not really at scale yet. And we're not going to fix emissions in food with a solar panel and a battery or an electric vehicle. We're going to have to think really hard about these really stubborn emissions in food, agriculture, and land use. And I think food is going to be the kind of the next frontier on climate change. First, we started with the energy problem, mainly electricity and how it's used. But now we're moving into the food and also industrial emission spaces that are going to be the next nut to crack. And that's why next year, early in 2024, we're going to be launching a special initiative focusing on climate solutions in the food, agriculture, and land use space, a new Drawdown Food initiative, where we're going to dive extra deep, looking at these solutions all across the world and putting together the best possible portfolio of solutions to address emissions in this critical space. We're just beginning to hear about food at the COP meetings, but we're going to need to hear a lot more. Another thing we're going to have to do is take a broader perspective than just climate change, because that's not the only environmental issue happening on this planet. As serious as it is, stopping climate change is one of many big environmental issues that we're facing. And we're going to have to start solving them simultaneously and with synergy so that we can actually stop climate change and do things like protect biodiversity, maintain clean water and accessible water for the world, and so on and so on. So we're beginning to think about how we can develop frameworks that not only address climate change, but also protect nature, whether it's in our forest, grasslands and savannas, our freshwater systems, our coastal systems and oceans, and so on. And so along the way, we're going to start to develop a drawdown framework, set of solutions for biodiversity, for nature. This doesn't exist yet. For years, people have come to us saying, hey, there ought to be a drawdown, but for biodiversity and for water and so on. But nobody's done it, so I guess we're going to. So later next year, we're also going to be focusing a lot more on biodiversity and launching a big new climate solutions kind of framework, but this time applied to biodiversity, and looking how we can solve for climate and nature and people simultaneously in a much more holistic approach. So stay tuned for that. I'm giving you a little sneak peek into some things we've got on deck for the middle of 2024 and beyond. So that's where the science is kind of helping us, moving from the what of climate tools and solutions to the how of climate action and strategy, but also taking a deeper dive into what's working and where are we stuck, highlighting the importance of food and also industry, but also the need to kind of go wider and realize we need to solve climate change and biodiversity and water and many other things on this planet simultaneously. And that's where we're going to be pushing ahead into the future. This is where the science needs to go. We also need to keep fostering bold climate leadership, and leadership comes on many levels. It's not, thank God, the only leadership in the world isn't going to be at the UN or in the US Congress. If we're going to wait for those guys to solve the climate problem, we're in for a big problem. But other kinds of climate leadership are also possible on that bigger chessboard, of course. And one of the things we've been doing is trying to push the private sector to do more too. And one of the things we've been very proud of is our work in Drawdown Labs, where we've worked with businesses to really challenge them on what it means to be a leader in climate change. It's not enough to just greenwash and come up with a nice brochure talking about how green you are. It's not enough to just say, yeah, by 2050, we'll cut our emissions and be net zero. We need to push climate leadership in many more dimensions. And one of those is to help use the power of business and their collective voice to also inspire policy change and changes in other places. So this is on the right here, we show an ad we put out in the New York Times, working with about 20 leading businesses around the world, urging the US Congress and the White House to act on climate change. And we think this kind of combination of environmental groups, science groups, and businesses constructively working together to urge new policy change can be very powerful and very effective. And we hope to see a lot more of this. The other thing we need to do is inspire leadership, not just at the top of companies, but throughout big organizations. And this is where our colleague Jamie Alexander, who coined the phrase every job as a climate job, has really inspired us to do this kind of work to create job action guides to show, yeah, everybody can play a role in addressing climate change. If you work in marketing, great, you're important here. You're a lawyer, you're an engineer, you're an accountant. We need you, and we need you, and we need you. And now Drawdown has guides for how different kind of professions can play a role in climate action. So check this out on our website. We just released a couple of weeks ago a whole new suite of job action guides showing that it's not just the job of the C-suite or the sustainability person in your organization to address climate change. It can be everybody's job because everybody has a role to play on climate change. But this year and into next year, we're really proud to announce not only are we working with companies to help change what's happening in climate leadership, we're also beginning to work with investors and philanthropists, because one of the other things we need to do on that chessboard of climate action is move money. We got to move money out of fossil fuels where it's doing a lot of harm. And we got to pull it out of that and put it into things that can actually make the world better, like renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, non-polluting circular economy industries, and so on. So we're creating something new that will launch in early 2024 called the Drawdown Capital Coalition. That's going to use science to help guide the deployment of money, whether it's funders and foundations and philanthropists or investors. How do we move trillions of dollars out of the bad stuff and put it into good stuff that makes the planet better? Well, we've started to do that already, showing here a science-based framework which didn't exist before of where climate investing needs to go. It shows kind of where the money needs to be in electricity, in industry, buildings, and so on. This is what our science tells us is necessary. But then we looked at where the money's currently going for the people who are still trying to put money into climate solutions, whether it's philanthropy or venture capital, tech entrepreneurs, or even the US government. We're putting money into climate solutions, not enough. But the problem is, even when we do, we don't always put it in the best places. The Drawdown Capital Coalition is going to help guide the deployment of this money, this capital, to be the most effective deployment of resources and make sure we put the money in the best possible places. Speaking of money, one of the things we're also really proud of is earlier today, we just launched a new report that shows how we, as just regular folks, can also play a role in shifting the money that powers climate solutions. One of the things we like to point out is that all of us can play a role in climate change, and everyone on this call can too. Because one of the things we can do to have impact on climate change is move where we bank our money. It turns out most banks in the country and around the world take the money we put in our checking and savings account and they loan it to other people, including the fossil fuel industry. And some of the banks in the world are loaning tremendous amounts of money that are enabling new infrastructure in oil and gas and coal, which are going to lock us in to continued emissions into the future. So whether we know it or not, sometimes our own money in our checking account, in our retirement accounts, whatever, are inadvertently powering up fossil fuel emissions, but they don't have to. In this new report called Saving for the Planet, Project Drawdown shows how we can change personal banking by moving where we save our money to new kind of climate-friendly banks and actually dramatically reduce emissions that are part of our daily lives. So that report was just released today. We're really proud of it. I hope you can go check it out and see, even at that kind of personal level, just you and me and ordinary folks, and where we have our checking accounts and savings accounts can have a big difference. And we just did some of the science that shows how much that can be effective. And finally, let me get to this third pillar of what Drawdown does, is trying to promote new narratives and new voices. What's kind of fun and surprising for us is that a lot of people come to Project Drawdown and tell us that we became kind of a beacon of hope for them by simply just pointing out that there are climate solutions. A lot of them are really effective, and if we added them all together, they're enough to get the job done. That alone has been a source of inspiration to many people around the world. But that was just the beginning. We want to do more because, yes, we need to hear the bad news about climate change, the really scary stuff. We need to know the truth about that. But we also believe the world changes not only from fear, but also from inspiration, from a sense of opportunity and possibility and hope. And so we need to show that side too. We need to know the disease and we need to know the cure in order to make good decisions. So this is where we're moving ahead in our third kind of pillar of action, changing the narrative and amplifying key voices. One of the great pieces of work we're doing lately is work led by Matt Scott and our Drawdown Stories team that's showcasing new leaders across the United States, city by city, starting in Pittsburgh and going to places like Atlanta and New Orleans and Minneapolis and beyond. It's showing kind of community leaders, usually from underrepresented groups that haven't had the mic, haven't had the spotlight until recently, amplifying these voices and passing the mic to them to talk about the great work that they're doing across the country to take bold climate action that not only addresses climate change, but also helps build stronger communities and communities that center equity and justice. And so our Drawdown Stories work has been telling these stories across America. And just a few weeks ago, we released the latest installment, which is focusing on the stories of the greater New York City tri-state area. And here are some of the wonderful leaders highlighted in these stories. I urge you to look at these stories and be inspired by these amazing people and the stories that they tell about climate actions of kind of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, inspiring us all. And coming up next year, I'm really excited. We're going to continue to do this across America in more cities in the United States, but also we're going to start to go global in our work. And next year, also launching something called the Global Solutions Diary, where we'll be collecting stories from changemakers around the world, hearing their inspiring stories of solutions and communities, and also addressing issues of equity and justice at the same time, and collecting these around the world and offering them up to the rest of us. I'm really, really excited about this and how it could help inspire change and kind of warm our hearts as well as inform our heads about what's possible in the world around us. We're also going to start to work on new campaigns, and this is going to be really exciting. Led by Todd Rubold and our marketing and comms team, we're starting to work with some major media partners. And we can't say too much about this yet, where we're getting to think about how do we amplify these stories of hope and opportunities and possibilities, showing, yes, the climate problem is real, but so are the solutions, and so are the heroines and heroes around the world who can make change and amplify these to make a real difference in the world. How do we tell this at scale so it starts to be everywhere, not just in the niche places of environmental NGOs, but everywhere, in media, in billboards, Super Bowl commercials, on Twitter, Facebook, you name it, everywhere. How these new kind of drawdown messaging campaigns, which we hope to launch early in 2024 and continue on to the year, will begin to move the needle far beyond what we can do individually, but by working with larger media, how we can change that conversation at the larger global scale. So let me put all this together and then kind of wrap up, and then we'll turn to some of your conversation and questions in a minute here. But putting this all together, this year we've had a lot of work going on at Drawdown, but also in the larger world. But just to show you kind of what we've been up to, again, we've been advancing some of the science and strategy work needed to move forward, building new roadmaps, helping to focus on food and the next frontiers of climate change, but also going wide and thinking climate and biodiversity and people, and looking at this kind of triple solutions of climate, nature, and people at the same time. How we continue to need to foster bold leadership, not only among businesses and how they connect to policy and other things, but also investors, philanthropists, and even ordinary folks, and how we deploy resources. And of course, how we can have campaigns and new powerful stories that help kind of change the mix of the narrative. So it's not just the doom and gloom we need to hear, but also the inspiring stories that motivate us to change things. So to wrap up, I just want to remind us that we can absolutely still stop climate change from getting to that worst end of the spectrum, the world that would be terrible for the future. We can stop this crisis, and along the way, build a world we can be proud of, a much better world. But to do that, we do need all of us to be part of this. We need everyone, and we need you on this call to be part of the solution, to be part of the work that we need going forward. And a lot of people ask me and ask our team, well, how can I help? I want to help. What can I do? Everything. We need all of it. We need your imagination. We need your amplification. Please share what you do. We don't have big ad budgets. You see something from Drawdown or other environmental groups out there, help share it. Spread the word, please. That's crucial to our work. Your connections, introduce us to people and help tell us about new things. Your expertise, your insight, we need all of it. And yeah, it is the end of the year. So I'm going to also mention that we do need also financial support. We don't get any government grants. We don't get kind of big royalty checks or anything like this. We do need financial support from regular folks, from foundations and others to help power up our work. So we would encourage folks, if you so like, it's hard for us to ask for this, but we'd encourage you to think about making a gift to Drawdown or other environmental groups that you'd like to support. And no amount is too small. Honestly, it isn't. Whatever you can afford would be really, really welcome. And if you're amenable to this, go check it out. You can make a tax-deductible gift online. You can do a little bit every month. You can do it one time. You can send us a check. You can do whatever you want. But go to drawdown.org/donate, and I'll give you some ideas of ways you can help support our work, maybe financially, if you so are inclined to do so. And that would be great. And also, thank you, because it is the generous support of thousands of people around the world that makes our work possible. And without you, we couldn't do this work. And we need to keep doing the work of stopping climate change as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. And so thank you for showing up today. And to all of you who do support our mission, thank you so much. But in closing, I do want to remind us, this is the time. We've exhausted all of our opportunities to address climate change earlier on. We didn't do enough. We've waited too long. We kicked the can. We're not doing enough. It's now time. It's time for us to be bold. And something we like to say at Drawdown, and it's equally true today as it's always been, it is not yet game over on climate change. Absolutely not. But it is game on time. It's the moment for us to step up, be the best people we've ever been, and act with precision and accuracy and urgency, and go build that better future. So with that, I'll say thank you again, and thank you so much for all of your time and attention today, and hand it back to Todd and Elizabeth to see if we have some time for questions and conversation in the last 10 to 15 minutes here. And thank you again for all of the great things you do here. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you, John, for a wonderful presentation today. Hi, everybody. I'm Todd Rubold. I lead our marketing and communications at the organization, and it's wonderful to be with you all today. Wow, we have such an amazing audience tuned in for today's webinar, over 730 people from all around the world. Tremendous questions, too, which we'll try to get to a few of those in the time that we have left here today. And then we'll also be sending out a recording of this presentation very soon. So stay tuned for that arriving in your inbox shortly, along with the links that we've been sharing in the chat here today. John, just starting at the beginning, someone was wondering, you mentioned that one of the goals was winning the race, and they were just curious for a little more detail on what winning looks like in your mind.
Well, in this race between two futures, a critical part of winning it, not the only part at all. I would never presume to, say this is the way the world must be. But one of the necessary, though not sufficient things to building a better future is stopping climate change. And that's, at the end of the day, is very simple. We've got to stop the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And mostly that's cutting the damn emissions. There's just no other way to do the math. So that's just one of the key things we need to do to win this race. We got to stop emitting stuff that's destroying the planet, period. And that means moving away from fossil fuels rapidly. It means stopping destructive agriculture and polluting industries and replacing them with something better. And so at Drawdown, we know that we have to amplify these solutions, the things that can continue the human enterprise, but in ways that don't pollute, that don't cause harm, and actually build a better world. And the good news is those solutions are here. So winning that race means we do enough, fast enough, and we do it in time. The good news is we're seeing some promising trends, finally. A lot of people are really surprised to hear this. But guess what? I've been working on climate change now professionally for over 30 years, and I've never been more hopeful about our chances to stop climate change than I am right now. A lot of people are surprised to hear that. Like, how can you be hopeful? Like, I'm amazingly hopeful right now when I look at the trends underneath the trends, because this is how change always happens in the world. It's nothing, 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 then boom, all at once. And I think we're about to hit that inflection point. Because look at it, dozens of countries in the world, including countries like the US, even during the Trump administration, we were cutting our emissions because we finally have the tools to do it. We have renewable energy that's better and cheaper than fossil fuels now. We have cars and heat pumps and things like this that are better than the alternatives. We have stuff that works. That's amazing. That wasn't true 20 years ago, but it is now. Finally, we've got the tools. Now we just got to go do it. We also see trends like China is peaking their emissions starting next year. China's emissions, which are now the largest in the world, will start to go down years earlier than we ever thought possible. And so, yeah, the politicians will drag their feet. Yes, the oil companies are going to throw dust in our eyes and try to delay us. But this is inevitable now, folks. When climate solutions are better and cheaper and cleaner and just plain better than what we were doing before, we will win. That wasn't true until maybe the last couple of years. It finally is. Now it's just a question of speed. How quickly can we pull it off? But I know we're going to win. But how much we can do as quickly as we can, that's the key thing.
I just want to note, I see someone in the chat mention to the hosts and panelists that they're using Project Drawdown resources in teaching English to 12th graders. And then the students on climate solutions projects based on that. And just want to do a quick plug again for Drawdown's Neighborhood. If you haven't checked it out, along with the amazing videos that Matt and the Stories team have produced, there are also resources embedded with each of those videos that help you to take those conversations further into communities, classrooms, et cetera. So check that out too. John, a few people have been asking about putting a price on carbon pollution. And one of the questions that came through is, would putting a price on carbon pollution be an example of an emergency brake?
Yeah, we've been talking for decades that the best, if the world were rational, if the world were rational, we would maybe we should tax the pollution and use that money to subsidize the stuff that's better. If we tax the carbon and use that money then to give rebates to people for, switching to renewables and alternatives, wouldn't that be kind of a rational policy and economic instrument? Yeah, absolutely. And every model in the world and every economist in the world would say, yes, this is the most effective thing we could possibly do. But then we get the politicians in there who hate the word tax or fee or price. And of course, the people who don't want this to happen are really good at kind of messaging very, very destructive kind of messages. They'll say, oh, it's a tax on hamburgers, it's trying to take away your SUVs and all this kind of stuff. And politicians, frankly, are wimps. They are not bold leaders. And so this is something very hard for them to implement. So I do find that discouraging. The best possible way to implement these solutions, we probably can't get in many countries the political leadership needed to pull it off. Some are trying. It is in Canada, parts of Europe, some parts of the world do have these kind of carbon prices, but we're not going to get them everywhere. In the meantime, the same effect could happen if here's something that could work, I think, politically. Why are we still subsidizing fossil fuels at the tune of trillions of dollars? The most profitable industries in human history need my money and yours to be profitable? No, that's BS. So I think that might be politically tenable. It's hey, could we at least get the thumb off the scale if favoring fossil fuels, using our tax dollars to do it? Why are we subsidizing them directly and indirectly? That I think might be more politically tenable. So how do we just kill the subsidies for fossil fuels so they have to compete on the same level playing field as renewables and kind of green technologies? And when they do, green wins because they're better and cheaper. The only way fossil fuels kind of keep on going on is because of subsidies and their political kind of lapdogs who keep them going. We got to get rid of that. So maybe a carbon tax isn't going to happen or a full carbon price everywhere, but could we at least get rid of the subsidies, which is about half of the same thing? That might be more effective in the short run.
Before I get to the next question about one of the maps that you showed, Claire in the Q&A is wondering about what advice do you have for someone looking to switch into a career in the environment, sustainability, climate space. So just one more plug for the job function action guides that John mentioned before. because as Jamie Alexander, our colleague, has mentioned, every job can truly be a climate job. So whether you're working sales, marketing, legal, you name it, your job can be a climate job. So we put that link in the chat. We'll put that in the email that we send out again too, for Claire and everyone who's wondering about that. John, a question a couple people had around the maps you showed of emissions around the world. I'll just read one question. When looking at emissions from countries around the world, are you considering consumption-based emissions? Many of China's emissions are to produce goods used by the US and other countries. So just curious.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a technical detail, and when you do the accounting for emissions, you can count the emissions based on your territorial emissions, like what emissions were within the United States of America's boundaries, and you can count those numbers. Or you can do it what's called consumptive-based emissions, saying, okay, but when you account for the balance of trade, hey, we imported iPhones from China, but we exported soybeans to China. When you do the balance of trade of all the goods and services traded all across the world and the carbon embodied in those things, how does that shake out? It turns out in the US and most of the world, when you do that accounting for trade, those same 40 countries or so that are cutting emissions are still cutting the emissions. I know for the United States, for example, that when you account for trade of all of this stuff, the US is still cutting emissions. That yes, we're importing electronics and some materials from China, but guess what? They're importing all of our soybeans and a whole bunch of agricultural goods into China from here. And so the two cancel each other out, roughly speaking. And both have dropped by 20% in the last, since 2007. So yeah, the US really is cutting its emissions, even when you account for trade, as I said. And those numbers are are totally available. There are some, there's really interesting kind of technical questions. So like when you have an airline flight, where do you count the emissions? If you're flying from like London to New York, where do the emissions get counted? In the UK, the United States, or just over the mid-Atlantic into no man's land or something? There's all sorts of weird accounting tricks you have to do to figure that all out. But basically, there are the kind of wealthiest countries in the world, for the most part, with the notable exceptions of Australia and Canada, they have to catch up, guys, are cutting their emissions. And even China is starting to do that now too, which is really, really good news. And I want to find out where we're cutting emissions, how we can double down on that and keep going, and also find out where we're not and make sure we pay attention to that too. And there's some good news and some bad news in that whole language, but I want to look at the good news and find out how to make it even bigger.
A lot of buzz, a lot of questions about the food initiative that you mentioned.
Ooh.
So I'll pull out a couple questions related to that now.
Love it.
Is wondering, can you provide some more hypothesis on why the root causes of why emissions from food are still on the rise in developed countries like the US?
Well, food emissions are going up around the world in poor countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. It's kind of seems to be equally true almost everywhere. And the big emissions from food come from three huge sources and a whole lot of little ones. The three big ones are deforestation is number one. This is astonishing. About 11% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions still come from deforestation. That's more than the United States. US emissions are just below 11%. Deforestation emissions are just over 11%. They crisscrossed a couple of years ago. So, it's China, deforestation, and the United States are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases right now. That's huge. And most of that deforestation is for beef, and then for soybeans as animal feed, also for beef, mainly for pork, actually, though, in that case. And third, for palm oil. So that's huge. We've got like three commodities in three parts of the world: the Amazon, Indonesia, West and Central Africa. That's huge. And we know how to solve that, and we got to get to it. Number two, animals. Yeah, I know a lot of people don't want to hear this, and there's all sorts of convoluted arguments about why it's not true, but it is, is that animals emit methane. And rice fields do too, but mostly it's animals, mostly beef and dairy. We got to figure that out. How do we not have animals produce methane, either by changing their diets or how we manage them, or maybe having less reliance on beef and dairy as part of our diets, and also promoting regenerative agriculture that maybe can offset some of those emissions. We're going to do all three. And then finally is a greenhouse gas very few people hear about called nitrous oxide, or N2O, which comes from overusing fertilizers and manure on our farm fields. So believe it or not, it's using all that spray and spray fertilizer and all that manure around the world is causing something called N2O emissions. So it's deforestation, too many animals not managed very well, and too much fertilizer. That's the big chunk of food. Then we got everything else: transporting food, processing food, refrigerating food, throwing food away into landfills. That's why food waste is so important. It can reduce the need to grow all that food. Since we throw about a third of the food away in the world, that meant we didn't have to grow a third of it and all the pollution it caused. And we don't have to throw it into landfills where it produces methane. So food waste, diets, protecting rainforests, regenerative agriculture, there are dozens and dozens of solutions out there to food. The problem is people like to just pick their favorites. They think there's a silver bullet. People might say, oh, if I just become a vegetarian, suddenly all the problems go away. Well, not quite. They help. It helps, but not everybody's going to do that either. Or if I just reduce food waste, or if I just farmed regeneratively, I've got the silver bullet. Not quite. We've got to put this together in a portfolio, working together, where reducing food waste and some shifts in diets and changing biofuels and protecting rainforest and farming better and reducing food waste to landfills. It's and, not one of the above, is the only way we can solve this emissions problems. And I think we've got some ways to do that, which are going to be super exciting.
I just want to do one more quick plug for the banking report that came out today, and just mention that a couple of people have asked about, the banking report. It tends to be, it's pretty focused on the US. I did ask my colleagues in the background while we've been having this webinar for any other resources that look on an international perspective, and I'll drop a link that they just shared in the chat on that. John, one more last question here. There have been a lot of people wondering about the way that we communicate around climate change, climate solutions, and how we counter all the disinformation, misinformation out there in the world. So what are your thoughts on, what needs to change in the way that we communicate about climate change, and maybe specifically around climate solutions?
Well, I mean, there are many actors in the world all talking about climate change. We're just one. But what we've chosen to do is we want to be science-based and never deviate from that. If you can't trust what we're saying because it's grounded in empirical evidence, tested data, tested hypotheses, then you can't trust for anyone else. Science isn't perfect, but it does help keep us honest. So that's one of the key things we have to do. The other is we try to be respectful but firm. We want to be a trusted partner. We want to be constructive, try to work with people, but also call out BS when we see it. We do lean in. And we take kind of firm stances on things like I have recently on carbon capture, basically calling it nonsense. But we did the math. I got the receipts, and they're called physics and thermodynamics. And so, when we lean in on something, we want to make sure it's grounded and it's based in good science, but we also say it loud and we say it clearly. But we also, I believe, very, very strongly that we need to have a balance in the world between kind of the fear of the pending doom of climate change if we don't get it right, and balance that with the hope and possibility and opportunity of building a better world. Both can be true at the same time, and they are. The problem is we live in a world today where people are getting rich and getting famous off of scaring the hell out of us and dividing us. Our media business, our political business, and I call it a business, and activists as a business, are trying to scare us and trying to polarize us, telling us the world is going to hell and those people are to blame and the only thing to do is to get angry. I don't believe that at all. None of us at Drawdown do. We believe the world is actually amazing and beautiful, but it does need some help to stay that way. But if we take the solutions we've already got, we work together and we be inspired by what's the best of us to leave a better world for the future, to see the possibility of a beautiful, amazing, incredible world, the best of humanity, the best of who we are. That's when we're at our best. Not when we're angry and afraid, but when we lean in and do something beautiful for the future. That's when the world is at its best. I say this a lot, and I know it's kind of trite, but Martin Luther King didn't go around the world saying, I have a nightmare. He talked about dreams. And I dream every day of a better future and how we can work together to make it possible. And I hope we can work with all of you to do that.
I think that's a perfect place to end today. I just want to put one more plug in. This is our year-end fundraising right now. So if you're excited and inspired by the work that we're doing, the work we're going to be doing, in the new year, please consider making a donation. Any donation matters. So thank you very much. I'll pass it back to Elizabeth to wrap us up today. Thank you.
Wow, thanks so much, everybody. We had almost 800 people with well over 150 questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's give one more round of applause to John. I see the emojis exploding over there. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. We wish all of you a very happy, healthy holiday season filled with climate solutions. Thank you so much for joining us all. Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.